Forbidden Truth: How Global Business Built Hitler's Power. In the profound silence of the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation archives, amidst dusty folders locked away for decades under the top secret stamp, lies a document capable of overturning everything we were taught in schools, everything we considered an unshakable truth about the darkest period in human history. A document that states in black and white the names of not only politicians and generals, but also New York bankers, industrial magnates from Detroit, owners of chemical concerns from Basel and Zurich, as well as representatives of ancient European dynasties whose surnames still adorn the signs of world-famous companies, in whose logos we see every day on the streets, in stores, and in advertisements, never suspecting that behind them lies not just a success story, but a shadow cast directly from Berlin in 1933, from the Reich Chancellery office, where on the night of January 28th, the voice of President Hindenburg announced the appointment of Adolf Hitler as head of the German government. And on that very same night, across the ocean, in offices on Wall Street, champagne was already being uncorked, because the Nazi victory was not merely a political triumph, it was the result of a meticulously planned, years-long, flawlessly organized financial operation, in which money drove not only industry, but also ideology, not only factories, but the thoughts of millions of people. And if you think that fascism is exclusively the progeny of German nationalism, a flawed ideology that grew out of the post-war crisis and the humiliation of Versailles, then prepare to re-examine everything you knew, because today we will travel not to a war museum nor to the SS archive, but to accounting books, to joint stock company reports, to board meeting minutes, to telegraph correspondence between Berlin, London, Zurich, and New York, into that invisible yet profoundly real infrastructure that, like a giant engine, ensured the operation of the entire mechanism of the Third Reich, not only supplying it with weaponry, but also giving it the startup capital without which no coup, no dictatorship, no genocide would have had a chance of realization. For money is not just a medium of exchange. Money is the voice of influence. It is the language of power. It is the fuel for machines that produce not only tanks, but also fear and submission and belief. And today, by opening this forbidden chapter of history, we will understand that the Second World War was not only a battle of armies, but a continuation of an economic war in which not an idea, but capital was victorious. And the losers are not only those who fell on the battlefields, but also those whose names have been erased from memory, whose fates were swallowed by a machine created not alone, but through the efforts of an entire network of international corporations, banks, and industrial groups, whose contribution to the resurrection of Germany after the defeat in the First World War was so enormous that without it, perhaps Hitler would have remained an obscure veteran with a delusion of grandeur and unfulfilled ambitions, for it was the financing flowing from abroad that allowed the Nazi Party not just to exist, but to grow, to gain strength, to build the river cruisers of its ideological propaganda, to purchase printing presses for newspapers, to rent halls for rallies, to pay the salaries of the stormtroopers, to provide them with uniforms and food, at a time when Germany itself lacked the money even to pay reparations. And it was foreign investment, hidden under the guise of economic recovery and stabilization of Europe, that became the very bridge across which Nazism crossed from a fringe movement to absolute power. Because in 1924, after the failed beer hall putsch in Munich, the Nazi Party was on the verge of collapse. Its membership had dropped to a few thousand people. Its newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, was barely making ends meet, and Hitler was sitting in Landsberg prison, dictating Mein Kampf to his secretary, Rudolf Hess. And at that moment, when it seemed that the idea of National Socialism had definitively stalled, like an engine in the cold, those who saw not a threat, but an opportunity in this movement entered the game. An opportunity to create a buffer state in the center of Europe, one that was strong but manageable, anti-communist, conservative, oriented towards private property and military power, a state that could become a shield against the Bolshevik wave that had engulfed Russia and, as many feared, threatened to spread to the West as well. And that is why already in 1925, immediately after Hitler's release from prison, not only former frontline soldiers and radical students began visiting his residence on Obergasser Strasse in Munich, but also representatives of the largest industrial circles, invited to secret dinners where they discussed not philosophical treatises on racial superiority, but concrete figures. How much money was needed to re-equip factories, how much for the construction of new airfields, how much for the modernization of chemical production. And among the first to extend a hand to Hitler was the industrial elite of the Ruhr region, owners of steel companies, coal mines, and engineering giants, who understood that the new Germany should be not only strong, but also predictable, and that the Nazis, despite their rhetoric about fighting capital, were in fact far more loyal to big business than the Social Democrats or the Communists, who at that time were actively campaigning for the nationalization of enterprises and the strengthening of trade unions. And this is where the most interesting part begins, because the financing of the Third Reich cannot be viewed as a single act of charity or political support. It was a long-term, multi-level, transnational project in which not only individuals but entire corporate structures participated, operating according to a clear, almost military strategy where each company made its contribution to the common cause. Some supplied technology, some equipment, some raw materials, and some the most valuable resources, information and access to international financial flows. And to understand the scale of this cooperation, one need only look at one of the most famous companies of the 20th century, International Business Machines, or IBM, whose contribution to the Nazi machine of accounting and control was so significant that without it, the realization of the persecution of peoples on the scale at which it occurred would have been virtually impossible. Because when we speak of concentration camps, of deportations, we rarely stop to consider that behind every train echelon, every disinfection, every numbered tag stood not only human cruelty, but also high technology. And it was IBM, through its subsidiary Die Homag, registered in Berlin as early as 1923, that provided the Third Reich with the most advanced punch card systems of the time, allowing them to process millions of citizen records, their origin, religious confession, nationality, political party affiliation, health status, and all this with unprecedented speed and accuracy for that era. Because the punch card, invented at the end of the 19th century for the US Census, had by the early 30s become the most powerful management tool. And when the first nationwide census in Germany began in 1933 under the auspices of the Ministry of the Interior, it was IBM machines installed in the building of the Statistical Office in Berlin that processed data on more than 65 million people in a few weeks, singling out all undesirable people, socialists, homosexuals, invalids, those who would later be called undesirable elements. And it is important to understand, IBM did not just supply equipment. The company provided technical support, trained personnel, and modernized equipment for the needs of the Reich. And its head office in New York, led by Thomas Watson, personally approved all contracts, all deliveries, all modifications, despite the fact that the first cases of persecution of certain people became known as early as 1934, despite the fact that American newspapers wrote about boycotts, pogroms, and concentration camps opened in 1933 near Dachau. And even when in 1937, IBM developed a special punch card with a separate hole for designating racial belonging by the 6th degree, that is, accounting for not only the person themselves, but their ancestors up to the 6th generation, Watson not only did not cease cooperation, but received the Third Reich's highest award for foreigners from Hitler in 1937, the Order of Merit of the German Eagle, and only when the US entered the war in 1941 was the subsidiary Die Homag formally confiscated by the German authorities, but in reality, nothing changed. The same engineers, the same managers, the same machines continued to work in the previous mode, only now the reports went not to New York, but to the Reich Security Main Office. And when the final plan for the final solution of the Jewish question was discussed at the Wannsee Conference in 1942, the key element of its implementation was precisely this accounting system based on IBM technologies, because without precise knowledge of how many undesirables remained in each country, each city, each district, without the ability to track their movements, marriages, births, and deportations, it would have been impossible to plan the logistics of destruction. And if you think this is an exaggeration, look into the archives of Yad Vashem. The original punch cards are still stored there, bearing the logos of IBM and Dihomag, and each of them is not just a piece of cardboard, it's a ticket to Auschwitz, a verdict handed down not by a judge, but by a machine programmed in a distant American office. And this is just one example, one episode in the gigantic chain that linked the West and Nazi Germany during the years when the whole world, it seemed, should have been opposing the aggressor. But instead, it remained silent, traded, invested, and built, because business, as is known, knows no morality. It knows only profit and stability. And for many Western corporations, the Third Reich was not a threat, but a stable partner. A partner who concluded long-term contracts, guaranteed the protection of property, suppressed trade unions and strikes, provided cheap labor, including through concentration camp prisoners. Because yes, many companies did not just supply goods to the Reich, they built their factories directly on the territory of Germany and the occupied countries. And among them is one of the world's greatest automakers, the Ford Company, which not only cooperated with the Nazis, but was personally approved by Hitler as a model of effective capitalism suitable for a National Socialist state. After all, as early as 1929, Henry Ford received the German Order of Merit Cross from the German government, and his book, The International Jew, was printed in Germany in millions of copies and was mandatory reading for all members of the NSDAP. And when Ford opened his first European plant in Cologne in 1931, he did so not just as an entrepreneur, but as an ideologue. The factory was named Ford Werke AG, and from the very beginning it was oriented towards producing trucks for the Wehrmacht. And by 1937, it was producing more than half of all medium-duty trucks used by the German army. And in 1939, after the start of the war, production was completely converted to military needs. Out of the factory gates rolled not passenger cars for civilians, but thousands of Ford Werkes, modified for transporting ammunition, the wounded, and soldiers. And when the United States entered the war in 1942, the factory in Cologne formally came under the control of the German government, but in fact it was managed by the same managers appointed from Detroit. And even after the bombings, when the factory was partially destroyed, it continued to operate, using the forced labor of prisoners from the Buchenwald concentration camp, who were brought to special barracks right on the factory grounds, and their work was paid not to them but to the concentration camp at 1 Reichsmark per day for each person. And this scheme was so profitable that even after the end of the war, when the factory was returned to American control, none of the heads of Ford Werke were prosecuted. Moreover, the company received compensation from the US government for the damage caused by the bombings, as if it were a victim and not an accomplice. And the same story was repeated again and again, with General Motors, whose German branch Opel produced engines for Junkers 88 bombers, with Standard Oil, whose petroleum products fueled Wehrmacht tanks even after the embargo was introduced, with Chase Bank, which transferred money to German banks through Swiss accounts until 1941, bypassing American sanctions. And all this happened not in the shadows, not underground, but openly, with the knowledge of governments, with the approval of ministries, with signatures on contracts that still lie in the archives. And if you think that this was only the work of American companies, then you are deeply mistaken, because European corporations were no less active, and in some cases even more devoted to the cause of Nazi Germany. For them, it was not just an opportunity to earn money, but a chance to regain lost influence, to restore the empires destroyed after the First World War. And here it is impossible not to mention IG Farben, the gigantic chemical concern created in 1925 through the merger of 6 major German chemical companies, including Bayer, BASF, and Hoist, and which became the true heart of the Third Reich's military industry. Because IG Farben produced not only dyes and fertilizers, but also synthetic gasoline, synthetic rubber, explosives, and from 1942, the Cyclone B gas that was used in the gas chambers of Auschwitz and Majdanek. And the key point here is that IG Farben did not just supply this gas, it developed it, tested it, and optimized it for the needs of mass extermination. And its scientists, engineers, and managers knew what this product was intended for. They received reports, they saw photographs, they communicated with camp personnel, and yet they continued to work. Because for them, it was not a moral dilemma, but an engineering task. And when it was decided in 1943 to build a new synthetic rubber factory right next to Auschwitz, on the territory called Monowitz, it was not done by chance. Nearby, there was not only a source of raw materials, coal from Silesia, but also an inexhaustible source of labor, more than 40,000 concentration camp prisoners, of whom about 30,000 died over 2 years of the factory's operation from exhaustion, starvation, beatings, and gas chambers. And IG Farben did not simply hire these people, it rented them from the SS at a rate of 4 Reichsmarks per day for a skilled worker and 3 for an unskilled one, and paid this money not to the workers but to their jailers. And among those who headed this enterprise was Dr. Fritz Termier, who after the war was sentenced to 7 years in prison at the Nuremberg IG Farben trial, but was released as early as 1951. And in 1957 became the chairman of the board of the new concern, Bayer, one of the legal successors of IG Farben, and his portrait still hangs in the company's corporate museum. And this is not an exception, it is the rule, because after the war, most executives involved in cooperation with the Nazis not only escaped punishment, but continued their careers, occupying key posts in the new democratic structures, and even received state awards for their contribution to economic recovery. And to understand how deeply business penetrated the structure of the Nazi state, one need only look at companies like Daimler-Benz and BMW, which today are associated with German quality, innovation, and prestige, but during the war years were not just suppliers, they were part of the military apparatus, and their factories worked at full capacity, producing not luxury sedans, but engines for Messerschmitt 109 fighters, engines for Panther tanks, and chassis for anti-aircraft guns. And particularly noteworthy is the story of BMW, which was undergoing a financial crisis and was on the verge of bankruptcy before the Nazis came to power, but in 1934 received a contract from the Reich Ministry of Aviation to develop a new aircraft engine, and within 2 years began mass production of the BMW 802, an engine that was on all the main Luftwaffe fighters, and by 1944, the share of military production in BMW's total output was 98%, and all this work was impossible without workers. And when the personnel shortage became critical by 1942, BMW factories, like almost all large enterprises, began to use forced labor, not only Soviet and Polish prisoners of war, but also concentration camp prisoners, including women and teenagers, who were brought to special camps near the factories where they worked 12 to 14 hours a day without days off, receiving 300 grams of bread and thin soup daily, and the mortality rate among them reached 30% per month. And all this was with the knowledge and approval of the management, who not only did not protest, but even submitted requests to the SS asking for additional labor. And after the war, when BMW was temporarily closed by the Allies as an enterprise directly connected with Hitler's war machine, it quickly recovered, receiving orders from the American Army to repair motorcycles and produce kitchen utensils, and then returned to car production. And its post-war logos, advertising campaigns, and images of freedom and speed carefully erased from memory the era when its engines carried not tourists over the Alps, but death over London, Stalingrad, and Warsaw. And the same trend can be traced in other companies that seemingly had no direct relation to weapons. For example, Eastman Kodak, whose European branch, Kodak AG, was located in Stuttgart and actively cooperated with the German army, supplying film for aerial photography, for filming military operations, for documenting the occupation, and also for photographing experiments in concentration camps. And although the main office in Rochester claimed it had lost control of the subsidiary after 1941, declassified documents show that profit transfers from European accounts to the US continued until 1943, and Kodak AG managers remained in their posts and even received bonuses for exceeding the plan. Even more surprising is the history of the Maggi company. Yes, the very one whose bouillon cubes and sauces are in every refrigerator today, which in the 30s was part of the Swiss Nestle concern and had large production facilities in Germany. And when the Nazis introduced the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service in 1933, which required the dismissal of all Jewish people from state and semi-state enterprises, Maggi did not just comply, it did so voluntarily even before the law came into force, dismissing all persecuted employees, including scientists and technologists who had worked for decades to improve the product, and not only dismissed them, but also rewrote the company's history, erasing the names of these people from archives, reports, and photographs as if they had never existed, and continued to supply products to the army, hospitals, and schools, including special mixtures for orphanages where racially pure infants selected from mothers in occupied countries were raised. And all this happened under the guise of a humanitarian mission to feed soldiers, feed children, feed the nation. And no one asked questions, because asking questions was dangerous. And not only in Germany, in neutral Switzerland, in Sweden, in Spain, in Portugal, in Turkey, business with the Third Reich flourished everywhere because gold taken from occupied countries, from banks, from the safe deposit boxes of Jewish people, from the teeth of those exterminated in the camps, was melted into ingots and laundered through Swiss banks such as Credit Suisse and the Union Bank of Switzerland, which accepted it without question, without documents, under special agreements with the Reichsbank. And even after the war, when the Allies demanded the return of the stolen property, most of this gold remained in the vaults, because proving its origin was virtually impossible. The ingots were remelted, the markings destroyed, the documents burned, and only in the 1990s, after decades of pressure from the public and victims of Nazism, did Swiss banks admit that they held billions of dollars belonging to Jewish people in accounts and agreed to pay compensation, but only a small fraction of the actual amount, and only after the threat of a US boycott became real. And this is another lesson. Money forgets faster than people do, and historical memory is not something stored in a museum. It is what we choose to remember and what we decide to forget. And when we look at the logos on our phones, on cars, on food packaging, we rarely consider that behind them are not only innovation and marketing, but also decisions made decades ago, decisions that determined who would live and who would die, who would get a job and who would get a numbered tag, who would become a billionaire and who would become ashes in a crematorium. The most terrifying thing about this story is not that all this happened, but that it could have happened, and it could because the world was silent, because business put profit above conscience, because technologies created for progress were redirected to destruction. And today, when artificial intelligence, big data, biometrics, and automation are becoming increasingly powerful tools in the hands of states and corporations, we are obliged to ask ourselves, how are we different from those who, in the 30s, looked at the growing threat and thought, it's not happening to me, it's not my business, it's just business? Because history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And every new technology, every new contract, every new law requires not only a legal but also a moral assessment. And if we want the future not to repeat the past, we must not just remember, we must investigate, ask questions, demand transparency. Because memory is not a museum exhibit under glass. Memory is the living fabric of society, and it tears if we stop supporting it. And today, when archives are gradually opening, when new documents are declassified, when journalists, historians, and activists continue to dig, despite pressure, despite threats, despite convenient oblivion, they are doing more than just restoring facts. They are giving a voice back to those who were deprived of it. They are returning names to those who were turned into numbers. They are restoring humanity to those who were declared undesirable. And this is not only a duty to the past, it is an investment in the future. Because only by understanding how this could have happened, only by seeing how business, science, technology, and finance intertwined into a single mechanism of destruction, can we recognize the first signs of a similar mechanism in our time, in laws that restrict freedom of speech, in surveillance systems that abolish anonymity, in discrimination based on origin, faith, or conviction, in the silence of large corporations when basic humanity is violated. And therefore, I urge you not just to watch this video to the end, not just to like or subscribe, I urge you to act. Search for declassified documents, read archival reports, visit museums, ask the companies whose products you use every day about their history, demand transparency, support independent journalism, because truth is not a gift that is given from above. Truth is something that must be dug out, protected, and passed on. And each of us is not just a spectator in this film of history. Each of us is a co-author of the next chapter, and the ethics we lay at the foundation of this chapter will determine whether we become the generation that allowed the darkness to return, or the generation that said, "Never again," and did everything to make that promise not a slogan, but a law of life.